Hello and happy Easter. It's Elizabeth, and I'm excited to get to be with you on this third Sunday of Easter. I think you already know that Easter isn't just one Sunday, but a whole season in our church. Some of you might think of that circle of the church year, where Easter is a white shape, and there are 6 white shapes that follow that first Easter Sunday and lead us to Pentecost. In our church, the weeks of Easter are all white, and we celebrate them on 6 Sundays and over 40 days, because Easter is the biggest mystery and the greatest joy in our church. So today I started by saying Happy Easter, but I also could have said Christ is risen. This is a greeting that we use in the Easter season too. And if someone says Christ is risen, you say back, Christ is risen indeed. It's like, hi, or Happy Easter, Happy Easter. It's a call and response. I say, Christ is risen, and you say, Christ is risen indeed. So, let's try that. If I say, Christ is risen, you say, did you say Christ is risen indeed? Indeed is a word that shows you're agreeing, probably that you're excited. It's Easter. Christ is risen. You say back to me. Maybe you could try that sometime later today or later as we celebrate Easter by greeting somebody in your family that way. You could say, Christ is risen, and hopefully they'll know to say back, Christ is risen indeed. I think of this greeting because of something that we hear in today's gospel, but I also think of it because of a country that I lived in called Romania. And in Romania during the Easter season, there are many great traditions, and one of them is making really beautiful Easter eggs. Maybe you notice some of these eggs that are here next to me. I wonder if you can see the different bright colors that are on them, and I'm sorry that you can't feel them, but maybe I could hold it closer. These little dots are actually raised up. They give a texture to this egg. The texture comes from wax, and the wax is used to make patterns and have symbols. This one has wheat. This is wheat that's going up the side. Of course, we use wheat to make bread. This is one of my favorites. It has some fish on it. Makes me think of salmon, and when I was living so far away, it felt really special to have an egg with fish on it. Here's one that has a shape that's almost like a cross with some additional pieces, and you can see the wax is raised up off of those eggs. We carried these back with us. They're pretty special. This one is maybe the most special. My neighbor made it, Petruzza. She lived across the hall from us in our apartment. She made this one by hand in her kitchen, and it doesn't have any texture. What she did was she put wax on this egg in the places where the egg is white, and then she dipped the egg into red dye. And then after the egg had gotten red all around the places where there was no wax, she melted off the wax so that you can see the white of the egg coming through. Red is a color associated with Easter, and it's one that is used a lot in eggs in Romania. It symbolizes the blood of Christ, and we also celebrate with that color red and with the symbol of the blood of Christ each Sunday when we celebrate the Eucharist. And in today's gospel, from the Gospel of Luke, we hear a story that talks about the Eucharist. And it seems to me like it's a story that relates to us and our relationship with God. So this gospel that I'm going to read to you in a few minutes happened after Jesus rose from the dead on Easter Sunday. And remember, when we were in Holy Week, and even on Easter Sunday, the disciples were scared. They knew that the person who they loved, they knew that Jesus, who had been their teacher, had been arrested and had been killed. And so they left after the Last Supper, and they scattered. And on Sunday morning, on Easter Sunday, when Jesus rose, it was Mary and Martha who were there at the tomb and realized that the tomb was empty and realized this great good news that Jesus had risen. And so that news wasn't immediately known, and those disciples still thought that Jesus was dead, and they still were very sad and very scared. And it took some time for that great news to travel, and it traveled by people sharing the news, but also by Jesus showing Jesus' self, by showing himself to the disciples and to others. But they didn't expect that. And so the stories that we hear in our gospel in these weeks after Easter are of the disciples knowing Jesus in a new way, going from being so sad and so scared to being curious and having these clues that Jesus was with them again, and then to feeling the joy of knowing that Jesus was with them then and always. And last week you heard a story about Thomas. He wasn't with some of the disciples when Jesus came back and showed himself again. And so Thomas doubted, and he said, "Let me see the wounds in your hands and on your side so that I can know." And that was one of the first stories of Jesus coming back, his disciples coming back after he had been risen. And today we hear another one of those stories. And it takes place in a place called Emmaus, which is in Jerusalem. I've been there with some teenagers from Epiphany a few years ago, and I hope that it's a place that you'll get to go sometime when you're a little older with Epiphany too. And as you hear this story, you'll hear about some men who were walking to this town of Emmaus, and a person came and started walking with them. And this person was Jesus, but they didn't know it. They thought Jesus was dead. And so in this story, there are these clues that Jesus gives by the questions he asks and the things that he says, but the disciples aren't expecting it to be Jesus, and they don't know that it's him. So what I'd like you to do is listen to this story and try to notice when the disciples know that it's Jesus who is with them. I'm going to read it now, and it's a reading from the Gospel of Luke. Now, on that same day, 2 of Jesus' disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" Jesus asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter in his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But the disciples urged Jesus strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When Jesus was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were open and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I ask you to notice when the disciples know that it was Jesus who was with them? Let's talk about that question after we do an activity. It's kind of a guessing game. I'm going to go get set up for it now. Hi, I'm back. Now I'm in my living room with Rosalie and Andrew and a really big brown box. When we just listened to that gospel story, I ask you to notice when the disciples know that it was Jesus with them. And we are going to talk about that question, but I've got an activity to do first. It's kind of like a guessing game. So I'm going to ask Rosalie to put her hand into this box without looking and feel something in that box. Rosalie, can you tell me the shape of the thing that you're feeling?
It is round.
Okay. What about the texture?
It is pretty smooth.
Okay. Any other words you want to use to describe that thing?
Well, it has some bumpy lines on it.
Okay.
And it's pretty hard.
Okay. Rosie, would you take your hand out of the box? You just used some words to describe that thing. Can you step over here? Can you show us with actions, step farther back, can you show us with actions what that thing is?
Where?
Ooh, go back towards the piano. That one was harder to see. Okay. Rosalie gave 2 clues with her actions. Wondering if you can guess what that thing was. Rosalie, what was it?
It was a baseball.
All right. So I wonder, was it easier for you to guess that object by hearing the words or by seeing the actions? Let's try one more time. You can keep that question in your mind. Andrew, will you put your hand into that box? Do you feel an object, Andrew?
Yes.
Can you tell me what shape that object is?
Sphere.
Can you tell me anything about the texture of that object?
Scaly.
Are there any other words that you want to use to describe that object?
No.
No. So those were your words, sphere and scaly. Why don't you come over here by the piano like Ro did? Can you show us with actions what that object is? Anything else? So show us those 2 actions again. And what about the other thing? Okay, I wonder if you're at home, if you can guess what Andrew's object was. Andrew, what was your object?
Basketball.
A basketball. All right. Why don't you pull those 2 out to show us?
No, I got.
Nice. So this brings me back to that question about those disciples with Jesus at Emmaus. I asked you if you noticed when they realized that Jesus was with them. And I wonder if it was a little bit like this activity. They had some clues with words. Jesus asked them questions about what had happened back on Easter Sunday and the days before. And Jesus told them the stories of Moses and the old prophets. But those clues didn't tell the disciples right away that it was Jesus. It was the action of Jesus that made them know that Jesus was with them. So I'm going to turn my camera back to myself and to another spot, and we'll talk for just a minute and have a final craft we can do together. Hi, I'm back. And we were just talking about how it was the action of Jesus breaking bread with the disciples that gave them the information that they needed, all the clues that they needed to know that he was there with them. And it made me wonder whether you can think of other times when Jesus broke bread with the disciples. I wonder if you said at the Last Supper on Maundy Thursday. That was the time that we all remember when Jesus sat with the disciples in the upper room and broke bread with them and drank wine with them and said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And that's something that we do every single week at the Eucharist as well. And so this story today tells us about Jesus coming back to his disciples after he's risen and giving them clues. And finally, the greatest clue, the greatest thing to remind them of him, which is the Eucharist. And it's something that we do every week too, so that we can remember Jesus and we can recognize Jesus in our lives as well. I told you that we were going to do another craft this week, and last week we made hands that had hearts in them, in that place where there would have been nails in Jesus's hands. And here are our friends Connor and Ben with the hands that they made, their hands, in remembrance of that story. And I have a suggestion for you for this week, to make some new hands that connect to our story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus who met Jesus. This week, instead of making one hand with a heart, we can make two. They're connected. They're both our hands. And remember, our hands open up just like this when we receive the Eucharist each week. Our hands open, and that's a way that each week we are connected with Jesus and given a chance to see Jesus in our life. And so in just a minute, I'll walk you through how you could make hands, your hands for this week, to remember that story of the road to Emmaus. But first, let's close in prayer. Let us pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you for walking with us each and every day. And we ask that you open our eyes to see you and our hearts to know you. Bless us and keep us. Hear the prayers that we each say now from our homes. We may say them out loud, or we may just speak them in our hearts. Lord God, we offer you all these prayers in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thanks for joining today. And if you'd like to work on this project, here's a little bit more that you might want to know. I started with a piece of paper and I folded it in half, a hamburger fold. And I found the side where the fold was. And it's important that you put your thumb on the side where the fold is, because that's the way that these hands stay connected to be able to receive. As I say that out loud, I realize that actually when I receive, I put my hands against the pinkies. So I guess both ways would work. Maybe you want to put your pinky against the fold, but just remember to leave a little over the edge so that this paper won't be cut into two pieces. So I'm going to do my work like that. I'm going to get a pen and I'm going to trace my hand, and my pinky is just overlapping this fold a little bit. So I'm going to trace my pinky and my whole hand, starting at that edge where the fold in the page is. That's the first thing I'll do. So now I have my hand traced here, and you can see my pinky is right here over the fold just a little bit so that this paper will stay together. And then I'll get some scissors and I'll cut, and you can take more time than I'm taking. I'm going a little quickly so that you can get started. But I'm going to cut my hand here. And what you'll see is after I cut, you'll notice maybe if you're watching me that you can see a hand developing on the other side where I didn't draw any lines, since I'm making two hands. Almost finished. There's the ring finger. And then here we go, the fifth finger, the pinky. You can see I kind of left it connected. It's kind of smaller than my actual pinky is because I did not want to have the paper fall apart. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to open this up, and you can see now two hands. And now if I hold them, it's actually like if I were receiving communion. And now you can decorate this hand with those hearts to symbolize the place where the nails enter Jesus's hands, and also the love that Jesus has for us in that sacrifice. You could also decorate, maybe put some fingernails on, some knuckles. If you're someone who likes to wear rings or just pretend, those would all be things that you could do with your hands as well. And if you choose to make one, I'd love to see a picture, and maybe we could share it again in the future. Thanks for joining today. It was great to be with you.